Let's get to the point. Most challenges in Silksong are a lot harder than their Hollow Knight equivalents. I am not denying that in any way. But how do you actually measure a game's difficulty? Is it the difficulty of the game throughout its entirety, or only throughout its hardest sections? And if it is through its hardest sections only, then do we take into account all the potential areas of the game, or its mandatory areas? This distinction is extremely important for these two games because even though Silksong has this, Hollow Knight has this. And while you can make the argument that Lost Lace is harder than the Absolute Radiance fight on its own, the 40-minute to an hour run back that is Pantheon 5 kind of makes up for it. So it's important that we understand what is considered a part of a game's difficulty and what shouldn't count. Whichever criteria I choose would probably be wrong in some ways, so why not we just go through all of the criteria. Firstly, only strictly necessary skill checks. If a hard area is optional, then that area does not increase the difficulty of the game because the player has the choice of not going into that area. Therefore, the area can only alleviate the difficulty by making other areas easier, or not change anything at all by a player not choosing to face the challenge in the first place. Under this criteria, areas like Path of Pain, Pantheon 5, Coliseum of Fools, and all endings except for the basic one in Hollow Knight, and Lost Lace, all of Act 3, the Ascent to the Surface, and Mount Fae and Silksong don't count because the player can just beat the game without it. This criteria does consider that optional areas may make the player sidetrack to the goal of beating the game and therefore add some skill, but not enough to sway any scales in the case of these two games. Under this criteria, it is safe to assume that Silksong is harder. Its bosses are harder, double damage is a thing, and most importantly, its final boss is harder. The second criteria is the true ending, or all endings, or the hardest ending completion. Its logic follows the same way, but this time with more content. Now, Lost Lace, Act 3, and Pantheon 5 is back, but we still don't have Coliseum of Fools or Path of Pain as a criteria. It is safe to assume a player would fight in at least the second trial of Coliseum of Fools for the Pale Ore, but since the player would only do that to make the game easier for themselves, it cannot increase the difficulty of the game. The same logic that all optional areas are still optional still applies here, but to a lesser extent. With this criteria, Hollow Knight does prove to be harder, but only because it has a Pantheon 5. Shouldn't that give it some kind of upper hand? If a game is just a walking simulator for 30 hours and then on the final area it becomes 5 BC dead cells, does that mean the entire game is now suddenly that difficult? Should we now group the easier section with the difficulty of the later section simply because both are required for beating the game? That criteria also kind of depends on context. If difficulty is only seen as the obstacles in order for the player to get to their goal, then yes. Of course, if we were to split the two sections up, then the easier section would be labeled easier and the harder section harder. If we were only trying to see how hard it is to reach a certain goal, then difficulties do not average out, they only add on to each other. If we were trying to find the average experience of the entire game, then the story would be different. But now we're treating difficulty as if it's an emotion, as if the player feels difficult. The player doesn't feel difficult, the player can feel frustrated or puzzled or hopeless, but they never feel difficult. But let's say we want to gauge difficulty based on how much a player felt one of those emotions. Then difficulty would average out, which means that you could make the case for Silksong being harder, but of course Pantheon 5 is still stupidly hard to the point where it might outweigh anything else, but you can make an argument for either way. Just so you know, the moment that Silksong gets its own Pantheon 5, this whole list is going to be just straight Silksong. Lastly is 100%. 100% doesn't just mean whatever the game determines as 100% completion, it means everything. If it didn't, then Path of Pain wouldn't count as difficulty at all, and that just wouldn't be right. Now all trials are mandatory, which means they all add to difficulty. And under this assumption, Hollow Knight is definitely harder. Path of Pain, Coliseum of Fools, and Pantheon 5 is simply too much of a challenge. That being said, Silksong hasn't gotten its extra content, so this list isn't absolute. But due to the lack of Silksong's extra content, it makes this moment in time a really good time to talk about how weird the criteria for difficulty is in games. There are even more criteria to difficulty than I just pointed out here, and each one adds an extra dimension to the compass that I frankly just don't want to think about. In short, difficulty means a lot of things. What you really should be asking is, why do you even care about difficulty? By answering that, you can then choose your criteria based off of your reason. But why you should care about difficulty is for an entirely different video. This video's purpose is complete, and so, it's done. Goodbye. Watch another one of my videos or something. Subscribe, do something, I don't care. The video's over.